All right. Before we talk about today's chapter, I just want to address a question. I have been asked how many chapters are in this book, and yes, that is a good question. So, officially, there are 30 chapters in this book. However, this book is unique because there's actually only 17 chapters that consist of the story, and then chapters 18 through 30 are sort of just the notes of the interview that took place in the 1930s with my ancestor who wrote this book and Elizabeth. So she categorized that interview, she broke it down and organized it into chapters, but it doesn't quite flow like a story. It's kind of all over the place, going back and forth into different parts of her life up until she passes away. So when we get to that point, I will be asking the readers if you guys would like me to just finish the book on chapter 17, or if you'd like me to continue all the way to the end to get to the full interview. You can start now if you'd like, leaving your comments down below in the video and telling me your thoughts and feelings about that. I'm happy to do either. There are a lot of things in the interview that didn't quite make it into the story, so it's definitely fascinating. Okay, in today's chapter, Sarah and Will finally meet up. Who's excited? I don't think we need to do any talking or commentary right now because I think we all just want to get right into it. So let's go ahead and get reading. Chapter 7. Sarah was not idle while she awaited Will's return. Every day she went to Mrs. Moore's, where she spent hours reading to Mary Alice from the huge nursing and doctor book. It was titled Doctoring and Care of the Sick. Mrs. Moore had them start from the very beginning. As Sarah read, she often stopped her, explaining the medical phraseology. She also supplemented their reading by having Sarah go through the actual procedure, such as making a bed with Mary Alice as the patient. As soon as you're a little stronger, my dear, you may work on Sarah, promised the widow. Sarah learned to give the patient a bath in bed, comb her hair, prepare nourishing dainty meals, etc. Although food was hard to get, former patients often sent dainty morsels, such as a little white flour, sugar, eggs, milk, even vegetables or fruits, in acknowledgement of a debt. To be comfortable, she explained, a patient must be clean. The bed and bedding must be smooth and clean. Usually a sick person's appetite must be coaxed and pampered. Always fix the food to look delicious, as well as to taste that way. Never give large, bulky servings. Better to have them ask for more than to overwhelm them by the sight of too much. Sometimes she was called away for an emergency, for confinements or accident cases. One night she left the girls alone together all night and did not return until the following morning about 10. She found them engaged in their studies. She explained that the baby she went to deliver had to be turned. There was no doctor present, and she had done the whole thing alone. And both the mother and child are alive, she announced proudly. I've seen it done a time or two by a physician, but that's the first time in my life I ever had to do it by myself. She took the book from Sarah and hunted through its pages toward the back until she found the chapters on childbirth and care of maternity patients. She read them the contents. I heated the lard and dipped my hand into it, just as it says here, she said, then reached up into the mother's womb, found the child's arm, and turned the baby so that the head could be born first. It was a breech presentation, and both mother and child often die unless the baby is turned in time. But why the lard? Asked Sarah. To lubricate my hand, so that it would be easier to insert it. I hope I never have to deliver any babies all by myself. Myself, exclaimed Mary Alice, her face paling. I think it's wonderful to learn how anyway, Sarah offered, just in case you should have to do it sometime. I'd love to nurse women with babies. It would be such fun bathing the little things and dressing them. I hope I have a big family when I get married. Boys or girls, joked the widow. Both, of course. Well, my dear, we'll see. One thing sure, it won't hurt to learn how to take care of them. If I had my way, every girl who intends getting married and becoming a mother should take a course in nursing and childcare. There would be far less deaths and serious illnesses if young mothers knew a few of the rudiments of caring for the sick. What were you reading about when I came in? She asked. What were you reading about when I came in? She asked. Mustard plasters, answered Sarah. And I'm going right home and putting one on Carrie. She has a terrible cold. She got her feet wet playing in the water yesterday and coughed and was croupy all night long. Be very careful not to burn her, dear. Just leave it on until the skin is a rich, soft pink, cautioned Mrs. Moore. Let me know how it works. You bet I will, but don't worry. I'm sure it'll work. I studied what the book said, and I'm going to do it right. Sarah was an interesting blend of her parents. She had the entrancing beauty of her mother and the determination of her father. She loved and appreciated beautiful things, but she was willing to earn them for herself. She enjoyed work, was industrious as well as ambitious. She was proud, but not vain. Her iron determination carried her through whatever she undertook. In pioneer days, the girls married very young. A bride of 14 or 15 was not unusual. On the contrary, they were accepted as quite the normal thing. But she the first, second, or even third wife. Most of the Latter-day Saints had come to accept polygamy as a fundamental part of their religion. The women looked upon it with varying degrees of distaste, but as something that must be endured, as a revelation from God. But there were some who could not tolerate the idea, yet at the same time were earnest and diligent in their belief in all other principles. The Mills were of this number. Sarah awaited Will's return without impatience, but with keen anticipation. She felt secure in the knowledge that she need never fear the addition of a second wife where he was concerned. Will returned the 3rd day of September. Not finding anyone at the little rented room, he cleaned up and went to Mrs. Moore's. He was surprised and delighted at the progress Mary Alice had made. She was no longer an invalid. She had lost some of the waxy pallor and thin pinched look about her nose and mouth. If she took a nap in the afternoon, she told him she could stay up and help some with the work. "And I'm learning nursing," she exclaimed proudly. "Both Sarah and I. She comes every day, and we study together. She hasn't been gone more than 10 minutes. How is she? And Charles? I found no one at the room, not even Phil. Phil joined the militia. He must be gone to a drill. Sarah's fine. I've never seen such a well person in all my life. She seems to radiate health. And Charles?" He repeated his question as the two sat in the clean little kitchen, with the door open and the late afternoon sun splashing long shadowy streaks of light clear across the floor and up the opposite wall. His eyes never left her face as he awaited her reply. But she did not meet his gaze. Instead, she fell to examining an imaginary spot on her faded brown dress. Will was her favorite brother, yet she loved Charles too. She knew he was their mother's darling, so her heart and her loyalty battled for supremacy. Will, who could not bear to see anything suffer, would himself feel responsible for Charles's loss. She dreaded to see the hurt and pain in his eyes when she told him. Finally, she spoke. "Charles went away a day or two after you left. I haven't heard a word from him since." Then she added, "But he left a note for you, with something wrapped in it. Wait a minute, and I'll get it." She hurried into the bedroom, returning with the letter. She laid it on his knee and sat down again. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Charles had been away many times during the past 3 years, but this was the first letter he had ever bothered to write to his elder brother. Only once or twice during all his former absences he had written, and that was to their mother, never to any other member of the family. Half-numb sensation, beginning at the base of his spine and slowly spreading like thick molasses, took possession of him. It was as though he had been told of his brother's death, and then found a small, warm, living part of him in his own hands. The letter smelled of leather and tobacco. He felt that if he looked up suddenly, Charles himself would be standing there in the flesh, accusing, bitter, defeated, yet somehow remote, separated from him by a void neither of them could close. "Aren't you going to read it?" Mary Alice finally asked. With an effort, he forced himself to take the letter from the envelope. The ring fell out into his palm. He looked at it in startled surprise, turning it this way and that, wonderingly. Mary Alice watched and waited, but said nothing. Finally, he laid the ring on the table and began reading the letter. "I don't understand. I can't quite figure him out," he said, half to himself. "Why is he giving me this expensive ring?" He turned to his sister. "When did he go?" "A day or two after you left for Provo." "Did he say where?" "No, I asked him, but he said he wasn't sure." Did he seem upset?" "You know Charles. He's upset whenever things don't go exactly his way." He picked up the note and reread it, searching every word for the hidden meaning he felt must be there. This wasn't like Charles, writing a note, acknowledging defeat, and leaving an expensive gift to the winner. Still, Will refused to believe his brother had been prompted by an ulterior motive. He deliberately thrust from him any such suspicion. Finally, he said, "I believe he means it. He's really taking it like a man. This proves it. Here, read it." He handed the letter to Mary Alice. When she had finished reading it, he gave her the ring to examine. "Oh, it's the loveliest thing I ever saw!" she exclaimed. She held it up to the light, then slipped it on her finger, but it spun around toward her palm, too large and heavy for her thin, delicate hand. I'm too bony, she laughed. "But it'll fit Sarah, I'm sure. If only I could be He wants you to be happy," she broke in anxiously. "Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone off as he did." "I want to believe that." "Of course he does. He didn't have to write you a note. Or leave a present either. He's never written you before, has he?" "No, but this is different. All the circumstances of his leaving are different from other times. All the more reason for you to believe he really wants you two to be happy. Why else would he bother to write and wish you luck?" "Yes, you must be right. That's the way I figure it. Just like Mother always said that he takes lots of love and understanding. We, his own folks, should be able to give him that. You have always given him that, Will, and more. I've seen how you used to give in to him back home in England. I was just a little girl, but I remember. And Mother was forever spoiling him, trying to grant his every wish. Now at last he's beginning to react favorably. He had to learn, sometime, that he couldn't have everything he cried for, and if he had married Sarah, they'd never be happy together. She'd never bow to him. She's too independent. No woman should be expected to humor a man's every whim, or lose her identity because she becomes a wife. We must give him credit for realizing that too. I've thought about the three of you a lot since he told me. No one could help feeling sorry for Charles when he knew he'd lost Sarah. It certainly did something to him, but it wasn't your fault, Will. And I'm sure he knows that. Nor can he blame Sarah for long. She couldn't help it if she loved you best. Surely he couldn't expect her to marry him while loving you. All this will straighten itself out in his mind when he lets himself reason about it. Only time can help when one suffers such great disappointment. All this will straighten itself out in his mind when he lets himself reason about it. Only time can help when one suffers such great disappointment. When he wrote this note to you, he was trying to show that he really wanted what was best for Sarah and you, regardless. The shadows in the room were growing longer as the sun sank lower and lower into the lake behind the island. It was still light enough for them to see each other, but the objects in the far corners of the room were now just dim outlines. You sound like Mother when you talk that way, Mary Alice, except that you were arguing in my favor instead of his. One thing sure, you aren't a child anymore. You've grown up all at once, it seems to me. It's about time, don't you think? Look at Sarah. She's much younger than I, but I feel like a child when she starts discussing things. I like being with her. She's so industrious and capable. Mrs. Moore says she's a natural-born nurse. I think she's wonderful, Will. If only I can give her the happiness she deserves. You're the one man who can, Will, dear." They sat in silence for a few moments as the twilight deepened. "Mrs. Moore is late tonight," said Mary Alice. "She's usually home before this unless someone is worse. Shall I light the lamp?" "No, don't bother. I like sitting in the twilight. I must be going soon." Then he turned to his sister and said quite unexpectedly, as though he could no longer contain his need to utter what was in his heart, "It was love at first sight for both of us. It was as though we had known each other always, but been separated, each searching for the other. Blindfolded. Then I saw her standing there in the doorway, and she saw me. The morning sun shone on her hair. She seemed to be waiting for me. She spoke, and I went straight to her. She came into my arms, and I knew I had found the woman for whom I had sought so long. She belonged in my arms. She felt it, and I knew it. Not until she spoke Charles's name did I realize she thought I was he. Only God knows how I felt. Then, but later at the dance, after I had made up my mind to go back east or to England, anywhere to get out of the way of her happiness and his, he insisted that I dance with her. Then she made me see that she did not love him. She declared that whether I went or stayed, she would never marry him. She loved me, even as I loved her. But God knows I did not want him to have to suffer. He asked me to give him a month alone with her. I did. Now I come back home and find him gone. He didn't see her but once, that's clear. She must have sent him away that very first evening after I left. He leaned back in his chair and began pushing back his heavy auburn hair, combing his fingers through it to force it back into place. He picked up the note and the ring and put them in his pocket. Strange, his leaving this note. I wonder... "Here comes Mrs. Moore now," exclaimed Mary Alice. "I'll light the lamp." "Well, well," chided the widow, as she came in just as the girl put the match to the lamp wick. "Sitting in the dark?" Will rose as she entered and offered her his hand. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm glad you've come. I wanted to ask how this sister of mine is behaving herself. We're as snug as 2 bugs in a rug, young man, and you simply can't have her back." She took his hand and smiled as she spoke. She had some corn and onions in her apron. It was tied around her waist, and she had gathered up the bottom in her hand, so as to make a cradle for the articles she carried. "Wouldn't you like to stop and have an ear of corn, or some new bread and honey with us?" she invited, as she carefully unloaded her stone on the table. "Where on earth did you get corn? It's scarce as hen's teeth in Provo," exclaimed Will. "Yes, I'd have something with you, providing you let me pay for your trouble. The same as I'd have to do anywhere else. Look here, Will Oakes, if I can't invite a friend to share a meal with me once in a while without expecting to pay for it, I'd like to know what the world's coming to. Here, you husk the corn while I get the kettle to boiling, and let's have no more fuss. Mary Alice, you can set the table. Put that Potawatomi plum jam on. We'll have onions, too," she added mischievously. "That is, unless Will here is going to see his best girl right after supper. Shall we let him clean them, Mary Alice?" They all laughed, and Will, in spite of himself, found that he was comfortably at ease in this woman's home, accepting her hospitality in the same spirit as it was offered. When they sat down to eat, the widow said contentedly, "You see, Will, we live off the fat of the land, your sister and I. My patients can't always pay me in money, so they send me fruit, vegetables, and what-not, to even the score. You must not worry about us. We're fine and so happy together." "There certainly is a remarkable change in her," agreed Will. "She doesn't look like the same girl I left with you a month ago." After supper, Mary Alice washed the dishes, and Will insisted on drying them. Then she took up the stocking she was knitting and sat down on the opposite side of the table. Will drew his chair up close to the widow's rocker and said, "Mrs. Moore, may I talk with you for a moment?" "Of course. Go right ahead, my boy." "I'm in love with Sarah, ma'am." He was nervous again, but his sincerity touched her. "That's no crime, son. Then she added, with a twinkle in her eye, "So are several other men I know. They'd like to marry her too, if I'm any judge. By the way, do you know a Mr. Lee from Iron County? He's the one who danced with her that night. The stranger, remember?" she asked, drawing her baby rocker near the table. "Did she tell you?" "No, he did. I saw him today, and he asked me where she lived. I've known him for quite some time, and heard tell of some of his carryings-on. He has 2 or 3 wives already. And if I know anything about it, he'd like to make Sarah his next." She was unprepared for the change in her guest. His face faded to a pale lavender hue, and his eyes narrowed to thin slits. He clenched his hands where they rested on his knees, until the knuckles stood out white and tense. "Did you tell him where she lived?" "No, I managed to evade the question. But he'll find out and be after her. Make no mistake about that," she warned. "Why can't men like that leave young girls alone?" She could see his rising anger and wondered what he might do. "You must remember, my boy, that all men are not like you. Some, such as he, for instance, use the right to marry more than one wife as a means of gratification. Perhaps they are not financially able to take care of one, let alone more. Then there are fine, sincere men who believe in the principle of polygamy and live it righteously. But the latter, I must confess, are few and far between, to my way of thinking. Seriously, I'm sure you have nothing to fear where Sarah and the man I mentioned are concerned. Even though he may want to get her, she would send him off in a hurry. She despises his kind." "Do you think he'll be there tonight?" "I hardly think so. There's some kind of meeting about land he came to Salt Lake to attend. I believe he's being held tonight. My guess is that he may try to see her tomorrow." "I intend seeing her tonight." "I intend seeing her tonight. But I thought I'd like to talk with you first. You know Sarah so well. She's very young and perhaps impulsive. Young man, Sarah is in love with you. And I hope you marry her soon, for both your sakes. But I'm afraid it isn't so simple as that. There are a number of things to be considered. She has known me for such a short time. I'm not a Mormon either. Her father is not here to give his consent, and last but not least, she was my brother's sweetheart before I met her." Mrs. Moore rose. "I'll get my yarn and wind it while we talk," she said. "It's already wound into 2 balls. Sarah and I did it just before she went home." "It's already wound into 2 balls. Sarah and I did it just before she went home," explained Mary Alice. "I put it in the bedroom." "Fine! Then I can start my shawl." The widow brought her hook and yarn and sat down again near Will. "I can always think better," she laughed, "when my hands are busy." She made a slip knot in the end of her yarn and slid the smooth bone hook through the loop. Then, like lightning, her fingers guided the hook in and out, and the tiny circle of work in her hand began to glow as if by magic. "I'll need this now that fall is here. I go out quite a bit at night if they call me, and my old one is about gone, too thin even to mend anymore. Let's take your problems one at a time, shall we?" Will watched her calm face as she worked. Already he felt reassured by her quiet confidence. He waited for her to continue. "You say you have known each other only a short time. My boy, there are some people we could see and talk with every day of our lives, and yet never know them. There is something about such folks that eludes us, so that we know their faces, their voices, but not their hearts. Sarah is different. She knew you when first you stepped into her life. That divine spark within her proclaimed you as her mate. She told me about it, and I feel as she does, that you belong together. Love at first sight, such as you two experience, is a rare and beautiful thing. I believe it with all my heart. It makes no difference whom she may have known before she met you, or afterward. There will never be another you for our Sarah. As to your religion, not belonging to our church is no crime. I believe that once you make a thorough investigation of our faith, you will want to become a member. Until that time, you are living a clean, decent, and righteous life. What more can anyone ask? Now, about her father being away. Sarah has already written to him about you, and she expects to hear from him any day. John Mills is one of the finest men I've ever known. He worships Sarah, and she is very like him. He wants only what is best for her. I'm sure he'd agree with me that she could be happier with you than any other man. Now your brother. I admire your consideration of him. Charles is certainly a striking young man, but he could never give Sarah the joy and security she will know as your wife. First, because she does not love him, and second, because he will never be the kind, gentle, considerate husband she will need. For, as you say, she is very young, but she's a woman, for all her youth, and from now on, men will be after her continually. That's why I say, I hope you marry her very soon. How do you think her mother will react to the idea? Martha is a proud soul. She wanted to educate Sarah and make something of her. So did John, for that matter. They will never be well enough off for that. But nothing will prevent Sarah from having her way in this matter. Now that she has made up her mind that she wants to marry you. Did she tell you that? Yes, she did. She comes here every day, and she confides in me as if I were her own blood. She had a dream about you, too. She told me that. But you mustn't let on I mentioned it. It just slipped out. Mrs. Moore, I'm going to study and investigate the Mormon religion, but it will take time. I will not be a hypocrite and jump into it, just to secure the girl I love for my wife. Tell her that, son. She'll understand. How does one go about learning the principles of your religion? A Mormon elder offered me a Book of Mormon and suggested I read it. Like everyone else, I was skeptical at first. I had heard such dreadful things about the Mormons, and especially that peculiar book, that it was a concoction of imaginary lies by Joseph Smith. But the young man left the book, and I started to glance through it that very evening. I read over 100 pages before I went to bed, and believe it or not, there wasn't a bad thing in it up to that point. For the life of me, I couldn't understand what all the ministers and leaders of other religions were making such a fuss about. The book was just a history of people who came from Jerusalem and settled here on this continent. It was simply told, and soon I became so interested in their lives and characters that I forgot all about the prejudice and criticism of my neighbors and friends and finished the book. That was my first step. I began attending their street meetings and finally let them hold meetings at my home. I could discover nothing low or wicked in their teachings. On the contrary, they offered me a better way of life, more to hope for the future than I had ever dreamed possible. Always they answered my questions completely and to my utmost satisfaction. So I applied for baptism and came to Utah. I have never been sorry. She arose and went to the shelf on the east wall, where stood several books. She took down a small, worn, black volume, about 6 by 9 inches, and returning to her guest, handed it to him. Here, she said, take this home with you and read it at your leisure. It's the same Book of Mormon the missionaries gave me, and I hope it brings you as much joy and peace as it has brought me. I have read it many times. Each time I learn something new that I somehow missed before. And now, if you are going to see Sarah tonight, you had better be on your way, or they may have gone to bed before you arrive. Is it that late? Only about 9. But with John away, the Mills retire rather early. Then I'll tell you and Mary Alice good night and be going. You have been wonderful to help me, ma'am, and I appreciate your interest in us. Thanks for the book. I shall begin reading it very soon. It was a calm, beautiful night. The stars overhead studded the sky with their delicate luster. The clear full moon lighted the earth below, so that it was easy for Will to see his way as he walked toward Sarah's home. Some of the windows were dark and blinked at him blankly as he passed, but others were still lighted, showing that the household within was not yet retired. All seemed peaceful, contented, and secure, here in the valley of the mountains, tucked away from the rest of the world's strife and contention. An ideal spot to make one's home and rear a family, thought Will, where none shall come to hurt or make afraid. The words of the song spoke in his heart, and for the first time he realized their full meaning, as did these Latter-day Saints, who sang them so often. He had heard them countless times while crossing the plains, but their significance had never stirred his imagination then, as it did at this moment, with the thought of Sarah and their future together uppermost in his thoughts. She was standing by the gate as he approached. She heard his step, even before she could distinguish his figure, far up the sidewalk. There was a definite feeling of fall in the air, and Sarah had thrown a thin, dark shawl over her shoulders. Her hair was braided and wound around her head like a crown. Behind her, a light glimmered through the curtained window, shedding a soft pinkish glow along the path from the house, to mingle with the moonlit shadows of intricate design from shrubs and trees on either side of the little house. Her hand rested on the low post that held the gate latch. The gate was open and swung inward, back against the opposite side of the fence. He hesitated as he caught sight of her, then, recognizing her, hurried forward. "Sarah, is that you?" She was in his arms with his cheek resting on the crown of her head. They stood for a long moment in silence, each drinking in the joy of each other's nearness. It was Sarah who spoke first. "Oh, Will, I thought you'd never come. I've watched and waited out here every night for a week. What made you so long?" "I just got in the city about noon. I promised Charles a month. It has been 5 weeks tomorrow since I left. It's been a long time for me too, sweetheart." "Will?" "Yes, darling." "I told Mother about us, that I love you." She whispered the words close to his ear, turning her head so that her lips were against his shoulder. "I wrote to Father, too. I'll be hearing from him any day now." "Does your mother approve? What did she say?" "She likes you, Will. Of course, you know how parents are. She tries to tell me I'm too young, but she was only 16 when she married Father, so she really can't object too much." He put his hand beneath her chin and tilted her face up toward his own. Gently he bent and kissed her. Then, as their lips met, he drew her still closer. She melted into his embrace, closing her eyes in the sweet glory of the moment. And that's it for today's reading. Yes, we're cut off right at the climax. And just as it is with life, whenever we reach a joyful climax, it always seems like the adversary comes in with a blow to steal that joy. So you can definitely count on some drama in the next chapter. You're soon going to find that the story has its ups and downs, and it's crazy to think how someone so young as age 15 can experience so much in those short amount of years. The things that Sarah goes through at such a young age in her life, some people don't experience till having been on this earth for several decades. So she's definitely one incredible stalwart pioneer woman. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's chapter, and as always, I would love to hear your thoughts about it down in the comments below. And I will see you next week for Chapter 8.